What are some actual disturbing facts about history you know? Story 1. During the Iran-Iraq War, the Iraqi army laid cables all around the Hawija marshes on the border of the two countries and affixed them to big generators. When the Iranian soldiers tried crossing the wetlands, the Iraqis would simply turn on the generators and the Iranians would drop dead. Afterward, they gathered all the bodies and laid them in long rows, several layers deep until the top layer was atop the surface of the water. Then they sprinkled the rows with lime and covered them in a thick layer of sand. This way they could cross the marshlands with their vehicles. They built roads out of the corpses of their enemies. The Iranians knew parts of the border with Iraq were heavily mined but lacked the equipment and training to safely remove mines, and doing so would have slowed any advance into Iraq. So they convinced young men that running in groups across the minefield was the best way for them to support the war efforts. Story 2. During the D-Day landings, they had a load of petrol tankers intended to drive up the beaches to supply the vehicles during the Normandy landings. The night before the landings, they gave custody of the various tankers to the drivers in charge of each. One of them was the grandfather of an old colleague of mine. Before getting a good night's sleep like all the others, he promptly drained off a load of petrol and sold it to his buddies for a bit of cash. On the day of the landings, all of the tankers that had a full load were too heavy and sank into the sand and ended up getting bogged down on the beaches, except for one. The lighter tanker miraculously made it up off the beach and promptly began filling as many vehicles as possible. For his sterling efforts and uniquely skillful driving, he got a medal. Story 3. The Mountain Meadows massacre was one of the few times that a wagon train actually had to circle the wagons to defend from Native American attacks. Settlers were traveling from Arkansas to California, while in Utah, a group of Mormons convinced the Paiute to attack the wagon train. Supposedly, some of the Mormons dressed as Paiutes and attacked with them. After 5 days of fighting, the settlers were almost out of water and ammo. Then the group of Mormons made themselves known. The settlers thought that they were being saved. The Mormons told the settlers that if they gave them their guns and the Paiutes their cattle, they would escort them to the nearest town. They put all the wounded in wagons with the women tending them. Each of the men was given a Mormon guard. Children 7 and under were put in a separate wagon. When the leader of the Mormons gave the signal, "Do your duty," the Mormons executed the men. Then the Paiutes killed the people in the wagons. Children 12 and under were allowed to live because they thought they would forget about it. One teenager had hidden in the wagon with the children and was pulled out of the wagon and executed in front of the children. Years later, during the trial, the children survivors gave testimony at the trial. They identified their parents' clothing. The only reason we don't hear about it is because the Civil War erupting was bigger news. Story 4. The Spanish flu killed between 17 million to 50 million and possibly as many as 100 million people in the 1920s, making it the second deadliest pandemic in the world after the Black Plague. Scientists dubbed it the Forgotten Flu because it quickly faded from public consciousness due to its spread coinciding with the end of the First World War, the spread of other diseases, and censorship to retain war morale. The Spanish flu also didn't originate from Spain. Its first reported case was actually in the US. However, neutral Spain was one of the few countries openly reporting about the disease at the time, making the country seem like the epicenter of the disease. The Spanish flu was deadliest to the young and healthy with a strong immune system. It would make the body overheat to fight the virus, essentially cooking our insides, once again proving that our biggest enemy is ourselves. Story 5. The U.S. government took thousands of Filipinos from their homeland in the early 1900s and placed them in a human zoo in Coney Island, New York for American entertainment. They forced them to wear their traditional clothing all the time, despite the colder weather, performed dances, and even made them eat dogs for the audience in order to emphasize that Filipinos are uneducated savages. The same happened in Belgium during the colonization of Congo under Leopold II. Tervuren, the village next to where I live, had a zoo where some black families from Congo had to live. They recreated the traditional houses in it to resemble a small village from Congo. People, especially the rich, could come and look at these people. It's truly sad to realize that these events took place. Story 6. JFK had an older sister named Rosemary who was hidden from the world. When she was born, their mother had a difficult birth that affected Rosemary's development. She had some behavioral challenges, but instead of working with her and trying to help, their father had adult Rosemary lobotomized and then tucked away in an asylum. without telling his wife or adult children. Happy ending, kinda. The siblings found out what happened and rescued her from the asylum and had her live with them. She was a beloved aunt to all the Kennedy children and grandchildren before passing. Story 7. After delivering essential components for the world's first atomic bomb to the island of Tinian via the USS Indianapolis in 1945, the ship was sunk by 2 torpedo hits from a Japanese submarine. The USS Indianapolis's commander, Charles McVeigh, was court-martialed after the U.S. Navy subpoenaed the Japanese commander of the submarine that took down our ship. Despite the Japanese commanders testifying that there was nothing the U.S. commander could have done to save his ship, the United States Navy still used the U.S. commander as a scapegoat to save their own asses from the embarrassment of this disaster. Of the 1195 crewmen aboard, 300 went down with the ship, and the remainder were subjected to dehydration, starvation, exposure, and non-stop shark attacks from ferocious oceanic whitetips. Commander McVeigh saved hundreds of lives, yet still was subjected to deplorable humiliation by our irresponsible U.S. Navy. Charles McVeigh committed suicide in his Connecticut home in 1968. He wasn't exonerated until 2000 by Congress. It remains the Navy's most embarrassing blemish of huge proportions. Please note, I did not get this information from the movie Jaws. It's documented in full detail in the book In Harm's Way by Doug Stanton. It's a great book, but pretty sad to read about the Navy's higher brass having used the commander as a scapegoat. The crew just seemed to be collateral damage. Steven Spielberg did a great service to the crew of the USS Indianapolis by raising awareness of their courage and bravery in Quint's famous monologue. Story 8. During World War II, the United States tried to use bats with small incendiary devices strapped to them as bat bombs. The bats would be forced into a sort of hibernation, loaded into empty bomb casings, and the bombs would be dropped over Japan. At a certain altitude, the bomb casings would open, and the bats would wake up and fly away to hide on the roofs of Japanese houses. Once the timers on the incendiary devices went off, the houses would start on fire. The project never came to fruition as the tests that were tried never worked as intended. Most of the bats didn't wake up from their forced hibernation. However, those bats that did wake up accidentally burned down some of the buildings at the test facility. Story 9. Christopher Columbus and his governance of Hispaniola. Basically, Columbus wanted to get gold for the European monarchies, so he enslaved and ruled as a tyrant of Hispaniola, nearly wiping out the local natives through slavery, violent rebellions, etc. In the end, the Spanish crown was so appalled by what he had done, they dragged his ass back to Spain to answer for his crimes. Story 10. The Jacques de Molay curse actually happened. We aren't exactly sure of what he said, was the 23rd and last Grand Master of the Knights Templar leading the order. The French Philippe King and Pope Clement V had him burned in front of Notre Dame de Paris in March. Molay appealed from this your heinous judgment to the living and true God who is in heaven, warning the Pope that, within a year and a day, he and Philip IV would be obliged to answer for their crimes in God's presence. Some versions also said that he cursed them until the 13th generation. Philip and Clement V both died within a year of Molay's execution. Clement succumbed to a long illness on 20th April 1314, and Philip died due to a stroke while hunting. Then followed the rapid succession of the last direct Capetian kings of France between 1314 and 1328, the 3 sons and a grandson of Philip IV. Within 14 years of the death of Molay, the 300-year-old House of Capet collapsed. Story 11. The Department of Defense proposed Operation Northwoods, which was a false flag operation that would utilize CIA assets to commit terroristic violence against American citizens and blame it on Cuba. Another one is that the stagnation of wages directly coincides with the downfall of unions from the late 70s to now. Unions kept American workers empowered and thriving. Once they died off under Reagan, American workers quickly started losing money, and this trend continued until now. Because of this, the average American worker is making $1,044 a month less than they would if labor stayed empowered. There was a civil war in China in the 19th century because a man claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ, and it ended up killing 20-30 million people. The last one is for fun, not disturbing. A Chinese general named Zhang Zhongchang once wrote a poem during a big drought in which he prayed for rain and threatened to order artillery strikes against God if God didn't make it rain. Story 12, the Battle of Tarawa. During World War II in 1943, it was the first beach landing in which the U.S. Marines faced Japanese resistance while landing on the beach itself during the Pacific Island hopping campaign. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, you'd probably assume that the Marines made it ashore on the landing craft after hitting the beach just like the soldiers at Normandy would do 7 months later in June of 1944. And you would be wrong. Tarawa is surrounded by a giant coral reef, and to make a long story short, the USMC generals and Navy admirals miscalculated when high tide would arrive to make the water surrounding Tarawa deep enough for the Higgins boats, landing craft, to actually make it all the way to the shore. Because of this, the landing craft carrying the Marines in the first few waves all got stuck on the coral reefs roughly 700 yards away from the shoreline, which forced the Marines to abandon their boats and wade the rest of the distance to shore for all 700 yards. So, these 18 to 25-year-old kids were forced to wade through chest-deep shark-infested water, walking on sharp coral while dodging machine guns and artillery fire for a half a mile. And once they made it ashore, they still had 3 more days of close combat with the Japanese before Tarawa was secured. The 2nd Marine Division earned their keep on that day in 1943. Story 13, The Trail of Tears, was a series of forced displacements of approximately 60,000 American Indians of the 5 civilized tribes between 1830 and 1850 by the United States government. As part of the Indian removal, the ethnic cleansing was gradual, occurring over a period of nearly 2 decades. Historians estimate that up to 15,000 men, women, and children died en route to these first Indian reservations. Story 14, a few I heard about in passing. 1. In the 18th century, a woman actually convinced doctors she gave birth to 9 rabbits, and she did until the doctors looked into it and saw that she didn't give birth to them, but she stuffed them up her, to make it look like she did. 2. Until recently, it was believed that babies couldn't feel pain, so babies often had operations without anesthesia. I think recently meant the early or late 1990s. 3. In the 1800s, dentures were made out of teeth from dead soldiers. Story 15, The Demon Core. Killed 2 scientists immediately and a few other people over time. Also, in 1987, there was an INES Level 5 incident, Level 0 to Level 7 Chernobyl, that occurred in Brazil, referred to as the Goiânia accident. A cesium chloride radiation source was stolen from an abandoned hospital and sold to a scrapyard. The thieves managed to breach the containment chamber and took the radioactive cesium out, contaminated 250 people and killed 4, including a young child. The people thought it was cool to play with the glowing material. It's amazing how many incidents have occurred over the last century. Story 16, the CIA created a gun that shot tiny bullets made of ice. The bullets were loaded with a poison that would give you a heart attack. The bullet was so small that the hole it created could easily be missed. I find it rather disturbing that they have a blueprint for an untraceable assassination device stashed somewhere just in case they need to kill someone or cover something up. Story 17. This is kind of more a possibility than a fact, but do you guys know the uncanny valley? The point at which something is too similar to a human being but not quite right. Anyways, this means that at some point in human history, there was something that appeared almost human in nature, but slightly different or off. And over time, the human race developed the evolutionary trait to be repelled by fear of things of the same nature. Gives me chills every time I think about it. Story 18, we've lost most of the world's history, and its documents can't be recovered from the burning of ancient libraries, to the fact some empires like the Persians we will never know, as all accounts were written by their enemy. It's why Rome is looked at so high, because they wrote their own books and they don't mention the enslavement and forced integration of other groups. Story 19, the origin of African American mistrust in the pharmaceutical industry, 1929-31. The treatment for syphilis had yet to be discovered and was considered a cultural embarrassment. Coup de Tuskegee, AL, where the PHS in America devised an experiment to study the effects of untreated syphilis on a black male population in Macon County for 6 to 9 months and then follow up with a treatment plan. 600 black men, 400 of which had undiagnosed syphilis, were enrolled under the guise of free healthcare and treatments for bad blood. Instead of this, they were not only given no treatment, but were required to endure unnecessary and extremely painful spinal taps among other experiments that had nothing to do with treatment. Those who had syphilis were never even informed and would often die during the experiments. This lasted for several years. In 1945, when penicillin was discovered as the acceptable treatment for the disease, the men in the study were actively denied it, not that they would have known that they needed it, because they still had not been informed that they had syphilis. Wives were infected and children were born with syphilis. 40 years go on, 40 years, and finally in 1972, someone broke the story and the government ruled the study as unethical and ended it. It's 2022, just half a century later. My grandmother is older than half a century. So please don't ask why the Black community looks at the vaccine for COVID with cold skepticism. Story 20, late to the party, but 5,000 or 6,000 there is theorized to have existed, a civilization sufficiently advanced enough to have exerted substantial linguistic and cultural influence over most of Europe and Central Asia, stretching as far as northern India, likely supplanting existing languages in those geographies. The issue is, we have basically no archaeological evidence these people existed, and for as influential as their language was, they had no known written attestation. We believe they do because of the linguistic reconstruction of a proto-language called Proto-Indo-European, based on consistent patterns of similarity between known written ancient languages like Greek, Latin, Hittite, and Sanskrit, that would have been unlikely to have spontaneously erupted in that manner without some common background. What is even more disturbing is that this alleged civilization, which also may or may not have been more than a loose coalition of nomads with no central structure at all, is a big part of Aryan mysticism, which is why Indian symbols like the swastika were co-opted by Hitler. The language that is most similar in grammar, if not vocabulary, to this hypothetical Proto-Indo-European is modern Lithuanian, which itself was a close cousin to the now extinct Old Prussian, which is where the German tie-in comes from. Story 21, the Black War resulted in the death of roughly 900 First Nations people and practically decimated the population in Tasmania. There were roughly 7,000 First Nations people living in Tasmania when European settlers arrived, and by the end of the Black War, it is estimated that there were only 300 left, with estimates that it could have been as low as 100. I think it is the only genocide to have occurred in Australia. The Black War resulted in the death of roughly 900 First Nations people and practically decimated the population in Tasmania. There were roughly 7,000 First Nations people living in Tasmania when European settlers arrived, and by the end of the Black War, it is estimated that there were only 300 left, with estimates that it could have been as low as 100. Story 22, there's a lost civilization called Göbekli Tepe that was built by hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago, around 9,000 BC. It was purposely buried underground by humans thousands of years ago, and the reason why is one of the biggest mysteries in all archaeological history. It changed our entire view on hunter-gatherers and what we thought they could do, and is still producing new information as more of it is excavated. Story 23, during World War I, there was a German gas attack on a Russian fortress called Osowiec, P.O. Sovets. The German force attacking the fort expected the gas to kill or incapacitate most of the Russian garrison, but when they charged, they were met by a small bunch of half-dead, grievously wounded, incredibly pissed-off Russian soldiers. The Russians were coughing up blood and pieces of their lungs because when chlorine gas gets inside the body, it turns into hydrochloric acid and eats away at everything it touches. They would have basically looked like zombies. Their appearance so terrified the Germans that they ran right into their own traps. The fortress was never taken, even though the land was. The Russians were able to repel the Germans just long enough to destroy the fort and run. The whole event is called the Attack of the Dead Men. I'm really glad chlorine gas isn't used in wars anymore. Story 24, not really disturbing but actually interesting. Before the market crash in 1929, Brazil was exporting lots and lots of coffee to the US and some parts of Europe, but because of the Great Depression, the US wasn't buying Brazilian coffee anymore. So in order not to bankrupt the coffee manufacturers, the Brazilian government bought all the product that was destined for exportation and burned all the coffee sacks. It's said that for weeks, the main city where the productions were located smelled like coffee. Story 25. During World War II, the Russians were training dogs to run underneath tanks with bombs strapped to them. Once the dog was under the tank, it would stay there till the timer went off and blew up the bottom of the tank. The problem was that the dogs were trained with Russian tanks, so they ended up blowing up a few of their own tanks before they realized their mistake. Story 26, German Shepherds were originally bred to be sheep-herding dogs, but this isn't what made them popular. They realized that they were fearless, loyal, and fast. They began using them as dogs of war in World War I. In World War II, had an extreme obsession with them. He had his own German Shepherd named Blondie. They were seen as soldiers. They were used as guards to prevent Jews from escaping concentration camps. They were used as soldiers in trench warfare. They were used as messenger dogs for speed. German Shepherds have killed more humans than any other breed due to them being used as a weapon by the Germans. After the war, many of the dogs were taken home by foreign soldiers to foreign countries. This is why the breed is so common all over the world. Story 27, Gilles de Rais. A member of the House of Montmorency-Laval, Gilles de Rais grew up under the tutelage of his maternal grandfather and increased his fortune by marriage. He earned the favor of the Duke of Brittany and was admitted to the French court. From 1427 to 1435, Rais served as a commander in the French army and fought alongside Joan of Arc against the English and their Burgundian allies during the 100 Years' War, for which he was appointed Marshal of France. In 1434 or 1435, he retired from military life, depleted his wealth by staging an extravagant theatrical spectacle of his own composition, and was accused of dabbling in the occult. After 1432, Rais was accused of engaging in a series of child assassinations, with victims possibly numbering in the hundreds. It came to an end in 1440, when a violent dispute with a clergyman led to an ecclesiastical investigation that brought the crimes to light and attributed them to Rais. At his trial, the parents of missing children in the surrounding area and Rais's own confederates in crime testified against him. He was condemned to death at Nantes on 26 October 1440. Rais is believed to be the inspiration for the French folktale Bluebeard, Barbe Bleue, which was first recorded in 1697.